Special Operations, Covert Ops, Espionage, The Team House, with your hosts, Jack Murphy and David Park.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 234 of The Team House. I'm Jack Murphy, here with David Park. And our guest on tonight's show is David McCloskey. He is a former CIA analyst. He is the author of Damascus Station. This one was very well reviewed, came out, like 2 years ago?
2 years ago. That's
this is the new one that's coming out in October, Moscow X. So next month, this one will be out. I read an advanced copy that your publisher was nice enough to send me. Really good book. So we're excited to talk to you about your work and your career in the intelligence community as well. So thank you for joining us, David. And I got to let people know about our sponsor up front, Augusta Precious Metals. If you guys text TEAM to 68592 or go to AugustaPreciousMetals.com, they are one of our sponsors. I hope you guys will check them out. So thank you for doing that. So David, I want to jump right into it with you. Tell us a little bit about sort of like what your upbringing was like and what your career track was like. What took you towards the intelligence community?
Yeah, sure thing. And thanks for having me, guys. It's fun to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
So I grew up in the Midwest, mostly in Minneapolis. I, as a kid, just read tons of thrillers and spy fiction and, devoured all kinds of nonfiction books about the world. And, I kind of had it from an early age, I think, a sense of like, and there was no sense that I wanted to join CIA, but the sense of like, I'm interested in the world. I want to travel. I want to understand how things work. Right. I went to college at a small place outside of Chicago, and we had a guy come through who ran at the time the Middle East analytics shop. So he was like coming through the University of Chicago doing recruiting stuff, and he was an alum of my school. It's called Wheaton College, and he came through kind of just to like talk to an IR 101 class, which I was in, and I ended up kind of getting in a way that I'm sure would make a lot of our OSS forebears turn over in their graves. But it was basically a guy showing up at a small liberal arts, Midwestern school and saying, hey, here's what the CIA is, here's what a CIA analyst does, and talking to a class. And I thought it sounded awesome. I mean, it felt at the time like literally my work experience was I'd been digging holes for a sprinkler system company, and I had been a cashier at Wendy's. Like that was literally the resume, like no joke. That was the resume that got turned in. And so when the CIA comes to campus, it's like, all right, this seems pretty interesting. I'm sure I won't get in, but let me just apply. And I ended up going through the process. And I think, it turns out one of the things that if you go into a small liberal arts Midwestern Protestant school, you're pretty good at passing polygraphs because you've got like, you haven't done anything really wrong, and you've got this kind of base load level of guilt going that's really helpful for the polygraphers so they know you're not a sociopath. And I got in. So I actually joined as an undergrad intern. So I took the poly and the full lifestyle poly and all the medical and all that kind of stuff, the psych exams, interviews, all that at 19. And I showed up the summer when I was 20.
Wow.
As an intern. And they threw me, I kind of describe it this way, like the CIA, at least from an analytics standpoint, basically hires for kind of two major profiles. Again, oversimplification, but helpful. One is like somebody who is extremely knowledgeable on a particular topic. Like they lived in Russia for 15 years and they did their dissertation on blah, blah, blah. And like they speak the language, and okay, bring that person on, put them on Russia. And then the agency goes after really, pretty young people who they think they can, make into good analysts and get them pretty early, right? So I fell into that group, got in, and, quickly realized that it, was a pretty big step up from Wendy's. And I loved it. I worked the first summer. They put me on Syria. Still to this day, I don't really know why. It's pretty random, I think, and mostly just because the guy who came to recruit was, running the Middle East shop at the time. And the first summer I was there was the 34-day war between Israel and Hezbollah, which,
This was
the
2006.
accounts, 2006, that's right. So the account, at that time, it was pretty small. Like, there just weren't that many people working on Syria or on Lebanon. And so I had the opportunity to, participate in a lot of briefings and to write stuff that, like, I probably had no business doing, but it was one of those things where you've got a team of like 5 or 6 and you're short on people and there's a war on. So, the intern is a member of the team, right? And I was fully cleared and working. So got hooked on it then. And then the next summer I came back. So I go to school, come back for my second summer. And that was the run up to when the Israelis bombed Al-Kibar. And so I was thoroughly hooked after those 2 summers. It felt like, man, this is exciting. I kind of am getting a sense of like, how does the world actually function? How do governments work? How does this region work? Right. And that was really addictive to me. So did that for 2 summers, got the full-time offer and jumped in. And I pretty much worked on Syria the whole time I was there.
That is like pretty wild. I don't think I've heard on this show. I don't think we've heard of somebody who like walked through the door quite that young.
Yeah, I was very young.
Yeah, a lot of people were like they had graduate degrees, or they had a military career, or they had a law career, or they're lawyers or something. I mean, coming in as an intern at, what did you say, 19 when you first started?
Yeah,
that's wild.
Yeah,
but great.
Yeah, it felt like, it was one of those things where even at that age, I was kind of thinking, this seems like a mistake. Like, I'm too young to be doing this. But I think there's a logic to getting people in the pipeline young. And frankly, now looking back on it, there's an element here of like, the further you get into a 4-year degree, the less likely it is that you're going to pass a lifestyle poly. And so if the agency can kind of give you, a pathway early, it creates incentives to not do things that make you flunk out,
Right. So for folks out there watching, and I know that you often are a lot of young people watching these shows that are interested in pursuing a career in the intelligence community. Can you kind of lay out what your job as an analyst was for people who just have like no knowledge and just, they maybe they understand we have spies out there meeting in cafes with people and trying to get information, but what's the analyst side of it?
Yeah. So I think, there's some flaws in this analogy, but I think it's helpful to explain it to people who don't understand the inner workings of the agency. Like, I think about it in a way as clandestine journalism, right? There's a story that you're writing for, and the job is primarily, writing and briefing, right? You're answering a question, a story for a consumer of that information, and that could be the president, that could be the director of the CIA, that could be the Secretary of Defense, that could be people on the National Security Council, people who are making policy, right? Or informing policy. We're not doing that, right? We're providing an input to the policy-making process that is trying to answer a particular question about what's going on in the world and why does it matter for us and what might we be able to do to shape that, thing to be more amenable to our interests. So you're taking in, as part of that process, you're taking in all different kinds of information, right? So you might have, let's take Syria as an example. We might have human sources that have access to people inside the government who are providing us information, secrets, right? They're providing us with secrets from Syria that help us understand better, what the Syrians are thinking or doing about a particular topic. There's satellite imagery. There's, open source press stuff. There's academic field work. There's signals intercepts. Phone calls, faxes, emails, things like that. You're taking all that information in and trying to make sense of it to answer that question for the policymaker. So the parallels to journalism are, okay, you've got sources, right? You have people, let's take the case of, human sources as an example. Like, you've got people who are providing us information that maybe they shouldn't be. So if you're writing a story about, corporate misdeeds in the United States, you might have sources inside that company who are providing you with, email records or things like that from inside the corporation. They shouldn't be. You have to think about asset protection and how you actually communicate with that person, all that kind of stuff. But in this context, it's information that's, highly classified and obtained in ways that were the sources and methods known, people would get killed. or valuable collection programs would be compromised. So you're putting all this stuff together, and frankly, the output of it is a little bit underwhelming in some cases, because it's like you might take a very serious, complicated topic like what's going to happen next in Syria, right? Which is the thing we were constantly trying to answer in 2011 and 2012 and 2013. And you boil it down to like a page or two. And that goes to, whatever that, whoever that senior policymaker is. And it's one piece of the information that they receive on that topic, but you're sort of feeding that consumer base with information about these questions that are important to the policy making process. And that's pretty much what you're doing as an analyst, and it's distinct from other aspects of, the primary other job inside CIA, although there are many, is, the folks who are actually trying to recruit, develop, and spot human assets and actually collect that information. So I'm distinct from a collector of information in that I'm analyzing the information that the collectors provide.
But you guys could assist them in finding like, hey, this guy in this ministry would be a prime target for you to try to pitch.
Yeah, exactly. Like we would help in the process of, now, oftentimes there's a lot of stovepiping in this business, right? These are big bureaucracies that don't always function particularly well. But in an ideal world, yes, we were providing input to the collectors on where there might be gaps. There are analysts with like targeting specialties who do a lot of the work that you're describing there, which is like, here's the 15 people, that we'd be interested in, in knowing more about inside the Syrian MOD, right? And here are the gaps that we have about, the Syrian military's plans and intentions and capabilities, and kind of feed that stuff to the collectors in the hopes that they can go and find people who actually have that information.
What was that communication pipeline like for you as a junior analyst, and then as you grew and became known, or became sort of got your bona fides, in the sense of first you're receiving information, and you're always receiving information, right? Whether it's the message traffic that's coming through, but you're putting your analysis, on it. But were there, I know that there are specific people for taskings, but how much input would you have in those taskings? Could you reach out to a case officer and say, hey, these are some other pieces of the puzzle, not necessarily this is a person you should target, but in these sources or these assets that you have, these are the pieces that we're sort of missing.
Yeah. That was very hit or miss depending on the personalities involved. I think I can think of a number of examples where, it felt like we just couldn't really get close to the collectors on things. And then others where, we would actually be in the meetings with the assets, because we, knew a ton about the particular topic that asset was feeding and, sort of the assets reporting on, and were a helpful partner for the case officer in conducting that meeting, right? To get the information. Because ideally you'd say we're in lockstep with the collectors because we're, really the most downstream part of the process before we get to the consumer, right? So there's a lot of value in the analysts and the collectors being really linked up. But I found it was pretty spotty how solid that connective tissue was. And, I think that's, we were talking a little bit before the show about modernization. I think that was, one of the primary, sort of problem statements in that bit of a reorg was like, can we create better connection between, analysts and operations and the tech folks to make sure that this place actually, does espionage better. But it was all over the place, truly.
Well, I mean, as sort of the shop, whatever shop you're in, as sort of the shop, as the subject matter experts, I mean, were there ever instances where you could turn around to like a case officer and go, hey, none of this fits, like your source is absolutely full of shit?
I would say there was a a slightly different tinge to that conversation when we felt like this source was producing stuff that was bizarre. It was less direct than that. I think that when you go to the operational side and they're doing the vetting, that conversation can be that blunt, not in cable traffic, but in person.
Right.
But on the analytics side, it's a little bit more anodyne. It'd be like, hey, these 5 reports, like, they don't track with the SIGINT.
Right.
Like, what's going on,
Right.
Or just frankly, maybe a stream of reporting from an asset that's like, this isn't particularly valuable.
Yeah.
So we would not do it that bluntly,
right,
because we're frankly, especially on the analytics side, when you're not talking about like CT, like we're sort of removed enough from it where we're like not capable of making as sort of direct and harsh of a
so you never
claim
sent
as
like
that, but
you never sent a cable back saying, hey, the Taliban do not have F-16s, get your shit together and fire this source.
No, I mean, we would be like, hey, this piece of like third-hand human that you collected here is like, this is crazy. Like, what is this?
Right.
And that then kind of filters back into the DO side of things, where they try to piece together like, okay, the analyst said this is garbage. Here's 10 pieces of contradictory information. Did this person make it up because they wanted us to pay them? Or
right,
is this a game of telephone? Or is this an effort to sort of, is this a more systematic effort to sort of mislead us on a particular topic, and we need to cut this person loose? So
yeah.
that would get kicked back to the DO side to sort of work through that. Yeah.
So can you tell us about we've talked about the farm, people talked about, sort of their case officer training. Can you tell us about what the analyst pipeline, how do they train somebody to be an analyst?
So I think they took us, it's probably changed, but at the time, more than 10 years ago, they basically took you off your account for somewhere between 4 and 6 months and put you at you're still like, you weren't living away from your family, but you were going to one of these sort of outbuildings in like Herndon or Reston or one of these other places in, the DC burbs. And you had a class of people who were with you, all other analysts from all over the DI, maybe 20, 25 of us. And they basically walk you through, a very excruciating deep dive in how you actually think critically, which, lo and behold, a lot of people coming out of a 4-year university are really smart, but don't actually know how to think critically. How do you write clearly and, without value judgments or colorful language or any of this kind of stuff that, if you've been, again, writing papers in an IR program, you have, there's a voice that you might have that they try to stamp out and turn into something that's like, hey, you're writing stuff as, you're not writing as David McCloskey, right? You're the CIA. So like, how do you strip everything down?
Yeah, this isn't an article in the New Yorker.
Correct. So it's really this kind of like down, take the thing down to the studs. Like, how do you think? How do you write? How do you take in? We're going to give you a lot of the exercises. We're like, here's a packet with like 600 pieces of information. You have to write an article on this, and it's like a page. Mm-hmm. And so, and like, how do you put together the what, the why, and the so what? Substantiate it, write it clearly, and do it in like, a page and hand that off. It's really hard. That is not something, it's not a skill that's really taught in most undergrad programs. And frankly, if someone's coming, a lot of analysts, particularly the kind of analysts who might come in more like mid-career or coming out of academic backgrounds, they're not doing that for the most part. You can learn it, but a lot of people haven't been practicing that. So it's a lot of that. A lot of briefing practice. So like you sit down, a lot of the customers, down at the White House or DOD or certainly in Congress are like really unpleasant to deal with. Surprise, surprise. And so, how do you actually engage with somebody who, you need to brief them, but they might hate the CIA. They might be a dick. How do you interact with people like that? And it's a lot of role playing. and a lot of writing. So you do that for almost half a year. You end up doing also as part of that, at least you used to, a rotation where like they take you and actually put you in a different part of the agency so that you get a different perspective on how the place works. That's not on your team, which I think is pretty valuable. And then they put you back in and you're kind of on the line, but that's more or less the arc of it.
Is there, for people who might be interested in this and know if they have what it takes to be an analyst, is there like an industry standard textbook out there that you can get on, your favorite bookseller or whatever? Is there, are there any sources you would recommend?
There's a book that's escaping me. There was a book we used. Oh, it's going to bug me. There's a book we used about intelligence analysis and sort of how you think about or how you manage different kinds of cognitive biases when you're writing and thinking. That is kind of it was the foundational text in the program. Because so much of it is like stripping out those biases so that you actually provide objective and clear information. It's going to drive me nuts.
David,
I don't know. I'll have to double back with you on that. But there is a good book that's publicly available that would give people a sense of like, here's if you're going through that, that analyst program at CIA, like everyone's going to read this and go through it.
Take 2 minutes to think about it if you want. But I have to do this ad read here real quick. Sorry to interrupt you, but if you think of it, I'd love to take a look at it myself. So our first sponsor for tonight's show, Augusta Precious Metals. If you're like me, you've wanted to buy gold for years, lots of commercials out there, but who can you really trust? I didn't want a bad investment. I didn't want to miss the boat either. Does that sound familiar? Fortunately, we've got great news. If you have an IRA or a 401k and want to buy physical gold, eliminate fear and uncertainty from the process by using the new Gold IRA Company Integrity Checklist that helps you evaluate and choose the best gold IRA company. I use it to vet Augusta Precious Metals, and they're absolutely phenomenal. Use the checklist to choose the best gold IRA company. To get your free gold IRA company integrity checklist today, text TEAM, TEAM, to 68592. Again, text TEAM to 68592. That's TEAM to 68592. Or go to AugustaPreciousMetals.com.
And our second sponsor for tonight is our favorite sports drink, Vitamin One. Created by a veteran-owned, business, created by former guest and SF legend Mike Taylor. If you haven't watched this episode, watch it right after you watch this. It's Friday night. You got nothing better to do. But Vitamin One is a fantastic. It's honestly the best sports drink out there. It's light. It's flavorful. It's not syrupy or heavy. There's no sugar like a lot of other sports drinks. Vitamins B1, B5, B6, B12, biotin, niacin, electrolytes, everything, it's got what the body needs, electrolytes.
Yeah, we drink it here in the office all the time.
Nonstop. It's fantastic. But Vitamin One, you can find it on Amazon, and the link is down in the description. Is there also a website? DrinkVitamin1.com. DrinkVitamin1.com.
But to buy it directly, you go to the Amazon.
Okay, yeah. So, yeah, you can get it off Amazon. But it's a fantastic drink. Highly recommend it. So, back to you, David. It's now with the analysis and when they're training you that in this craft, is it just a matter of like eliminating your cognitive bias and how to write? Is there, because obviously you guys are using these. I don't know if it's declassified, but but these programs, to create link chains and things like that, are they also teaching you sort of how to put these puzzles together and stuff?
Well, I am sure that the training has become much more rigorous, like in the types of probably software programs that are used, and frankly, like now in a world where you're talking about AI assisted search and things like that, I couldn't speculate exactly as to what they've how they've updated it, but you're hitting on something which you're right that I missed, which is like there's a weighing of, which I think is still true even in the world that we're living in now, a skill in learning how to weigh the information that you have in front of you. And frankly, so much of it is contradictory. It's like, what do you do with, you take my example of like, here's a packet of 600 sources of information. Well, 150 of them are crap, but they're not going to say they're crap. You're going to have to figure out that they're crap. And, another 100 are going to contradict the ones that you actually need to use to write. Like, so how do you sort of sort through that? Because it's not all just going to point in one direction, right? There's going to be stuff that points you or sends you down different rabbit trails. And so I think, yeah, you're right. It's not just the sort of elimination of bias, but it's also like, how do you figure out what's good information and what's bad information, right? That is easier said than done. And it's often very unclear, which is another reason why, like, we use a lot of it, and it drives policymakers freaking nuts. They hate it because we use this sort of probabilistic language,
right?
Or like, hey, we have, medium confidence in something.
Right.
Well, what the hell does that, what does that mean?
Right.
I mean, we wrote stuff where it's like, we have low confidence in this assessment. And, sometimes these, like, briefing where you're forced to go in with that kind of line, I mean, you just get this like eye roll from the person across the table where they're like, geez, I mean, that's like, this is the most useless piece of garbage you could bring me.
I think Obama said about the Bin Laden raid when they were briefing him, and at some point he was like, just stop making up numbers, guys. Like, it's a flip of the coin, right?
Yeah, no, that's true. And I think if I were across the table, I would have wanted to maybe reach across and strangle a younger version of me multiple times while delivering those kind of mealy-mouthed assessments. But there's a logic to it, which is like, we are providing the CIA's assessment. It's not my own personal opinion.
Right.
If I'm a think tanker and I go down and I talk to a bunch of people on the Hill, like, I'm not speaking for Brookings or the American Enterprise Institute or whatever, the International Crisis Group. Like, I'm speaking for myself.
Right.
Agency analysts aren't doing that. And so it's a lot more, there's a, pretty big rigmarole to go through to like actually get a piece of paper that has the CIA's judgment on it. And if you stray from that, it doesn't go so well for your career.
And the thing is that even though it's probably frustrating to the people hearing it, even if something's low probability, if it's it's like, in the sort of the Carver methodology of target assessment, even if it's low probability, but it's high consequence, you have to tell somebody, right? You can't.
That's right.
You can't go, well, we know they're going to be, assed up at us if we go and say this is a low probability, or low confidence sort of intelligence.
Right, because the flip side to that is like, if you have intelligence of a pending terror attack, right, but you think this source is BS, it's almost certainly not going to happen. But if it does happen and you were sitting on that intelligence,
right?
Oh boy,
right.
That's right. Yeah, and I think the most direct, that the CT example would be the best one, where there's it's like a duty to warn, right? Is what it was called. Like,
right.
Inside CTC, you would sometimes get pieces that were written or briefings that were done, or it's like, I mean, the CT analyst would say like, yeah, probably not, but what am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to just kind of,
I can't
log off and go home without
yeah.
telling you about this. I mean, yeah, you can't do that. And there were a number of instances on Syria, on even more sort of strategic topics where, it felt like, okay, the impact of this is such that we need to share the sort of low confidence assessment with you,
Right.
But less so when you're not talking about like, the impact of this being people might die,
So let's jump into that, because I'm continually fascinated with Syria and our involvement in it. It sounds like you were there from the very beginning.
Yeah, you were Syria before Syria was cool.
Right.
Yeah, it was not cool at the time. Yes, that's right. It was a solid 1 PDB a year account prior to the war, and no more. There wasn't a whole lot of attention on it. I mean, there wasn't a few things, but it was, it just spiked, obviously, once the uprising started.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like maybe we want to talk a little bit about the prologue to it. I mean, the Arab Spring, Gaddafi goes down in 2011, and then this
Yep.
thing migrates over to Dara in Syria. As an analyst, sort of what are you seeing? What's the vibe in the office around this time frame?
Yeah, you know, I would say basically every analyst, once Tunisia started, which would have been December, I think, of 2010. It was before the new year. And Ben Ali goes, I think, in like January or something like that. And every analyst I know who was working on any sort of Middle Eastern autocracy had like a piece in drafts about why it wasn't going to happen in their country. And it was said in like slightly, it wasn't said that directly, but everybody had good reasons.
Low probability.
Right? Low probability. Or, you know, I think the way we ended up framing it was like, here's all the different obstacles to a protest movement, right? And let's tick through those, which was an intellectually honest way of saying, like, yeah, there's a lot of obstacles to it. But, you know, it was a fascinating time to be on the account. I mean, I was actually in the region in January and February, and I watched like that Night of the Camels in Tahrir, when Mubarak brought in those goons, like literally riding camels through the protesters and like schwacking them with clubs and like polo stick. It was crazy. I remember watching that in Damascus, and like you could just kind of see people in Syria watching this stuff and realizing that there was a very profound shift occurring that wasn't predictable, right? But like you don't know when these kind of things are happening, but it was akin to, I think, what happened in, you know, Eastern and Central Europe in '89, where all of a sudden it's just like things are changed, and there's this mass psychological shift that occurs. In Syria, Syrians called it like the wall of fear, right? That there was this barrier to any kind of political activity or action, or resistance to the security services and the regime apparatus. And very quickly people realized, oh, you know, maybe it doesn't have to be this way. And there was a lot of there was a lot of kindling, obviously, in the country. You had pretty significant socioeconomic deprivation. You had the lingering effects of a drought that had been going on in the East for 4 or 5 years at that point, and had led to these crazy migrations of people around these shanty towns, around Damascus and Aleppo. You had, really predatory regime patronage networks that extracted from the country and from ordinary people and didn't disperse, it in any way equally. You had security services that were really the only effective arm of the state at that point. Most of the rest of the regime's institutions had been pretty hollowed out and were ineffective. Like the only ones that worked really were like the four major security services in Syria. And so the population, like the surface area with the population, was happening through the security services, which are Alawi dominated. And, you have these kind of guys who don't make a lot of money and have to extract it through graft and corruption from the population. And it was, you have a youth bulge, you have all the things, right? Like, so this is a place that's pretty primed for, and I mean, at that point, the Assad family had been in power for 40 years. So you're dealing with a pretty ossified structure that's lost a lot of its legitimacy, right? And then all of a sudden, people thought it could be different. And there was, in Daraa, down south, there was a group of teenagers who put up some graffiti. They got arrested, and there's a whole bunch of different varying accounts on this, but were probably tortured and certainly significantly mistreated. And there was sort of a back and forth between some of the elders in the city and the security services. And the kids probably got killed, a few of them, I believe. And there were protests, and then you sort of had this cycle start of like protests, people get killed by the security services, there's funerals, more protests break out, and it sort of spiraled from there. one of the interesting things is that those kind of incidents, like between the population and the security services, had been going on for a number of years prior. You know, we tend to think of it as like, oh, nothing happened, and then all of a sudden this happened. Well, not really. Like, these kind of things had been happening. It was just that this was the first time it happened in this new context of, you know, we can push for something to be different, and maybe the regime won't kill us. You know, maybe we can get away with it. And that's how it started, you know, and it started really and truly as a pretty peaceful protest movement for a while. And then the dynamics changed, which we can talk about if you guys like to, but it you know, that first bit of the one other thing I would say, which I think is important, is that first year or so of the uprising, you know, a lot of the press, like if you go back and read the regional press, or if you read a lot of the American press, you would think that the regime had started a kind of scorched earth military campaign, like right off the bat. And it's just not true. The regime's response initially was more waffling than anything. It was this sort of haphazard use of force so that it wasn't effective, and then giving concessions too little and too late so that they wouldn't actually appease people. And they really failed in that first year, I think, from a lack of decisiveness more than anything. And then, you know, as things became more militarized, they started, you know, in early 2012 to do a much more kind of scorched earth military campaign, which was like, we're just going to destroy places in order to suppress the opposition. And then you had, you know,
you mentioned that you were living in Damascus around this time frame. Could you talk a little bit about like your personal experience as well as like some of your observations, either work-wise, but also just sort of that experience of living there and interacting with the people?
Yeah. So look, I was there before the uprising started.
Okay.
I mean, it was a absolutely beautiful city filled with people who, you know, were incredibly generous to most Americans that they met. It is a, you know, wonderfully, especially in the center, I mean, wonderfully cosmopolitan place, exceptional food, exceptional cult. Like, it's just, I loved it. And it had a very kind of undefiled feel to it, because it hadn't been, you know, it hadn't really been open to a lot of sort of Western consumerism because of the sanctions.
It's a very like Arab city.
Yeah, that's right. And it was pretty a magical place. You know, and it was filled, like at the time, any Syrian, even though you could kind of see that people were watching what was going on in the region and starting, like, you could kind of almost see the gears turning when you would talk to them. But if you ask them the question of like, hey, could this happen here? They'd be like, no, you know, there's no way. Like, it won't happen here. But you could also tell that like something is shifting in it profoundly in the way that people
pausing with a cigarette held between two fingers, looking off into the distance for a moment,
just kind of looking off into the distance. Yeah, there's a certain wonder, I think, to seeing something like that happen, right? But I love the city, and you know, it was interesting though, like being in Damascus, and then like I went down. I mean, I drove down to Daraa a month before things started, because there's this really beautiful Roman amphitheater down there, and that city, you could just like the vibes are so different as soon as you get out of the car. And
was that Palmyra?
You know, no, Daraa.
Oh, outside. Okay.
Yeah. And I just did like a day trip down there, and as soon as you get out of the car, it's like this feeling of, hey, people are looking at you like they don't want you here, you know, and it had a very different feel to it, that when I look back and kind of think about the way the protest movement started, you could just kind of, it's one of those places where you can kind of feel the suffering, you know, and the fact that this is a people who are being excluded from the cultural life, the economics, and the politics of the state, right? And we're pretty primed for something. It felt very different from Damascus.
And I mean, we move the timeline forward if you want to talk about how it developed from there. What of course stands out in my mind that I'd like to hear your thoughts on is how a protest movement led to an armed insurrection, and then how that became specifically Islamized. I think is probably the topic to hit.
Well, so, the regime had an interest from early days in militarizing the conflict, because it could not figure out how to deal with, a large, pretty peaceful protest movement, which was like, hey, people are just out in the streets on Friday in large numbers demanding significant political change. Like, this was not a government that could deal with that. And so they did have an interest in creating and helping to create an armed opposition to itself so that it could fight it, and it could create fault lines that already existed in the society around largely ethnic and sectarian lines, but it could sort of firm those up and use them as a way to divide and kind of conquer the political system. And one of the things that the regime did was they released jihadis from Sednaya in April, I think, of 2011. They released a number of guys who had fought in Iraq and who had come back and who had been arrested, probably by SMI, Syrian Military Intelligence, for activities in Syria. And a lot of those guys, from Idlib up in the northwest, and they became the founders of a number of very successful Salafi jihadist groups that fought against the regime, and they were let go in April of 2011. So I think the regime fed some of this. At the same time, you also had people, and many of them were Iraq war veterans who had fought against us in Iraq and then had gone back to Syria. You had people who very reasonably saw that the regime wasn't going to cancel itself, and who, hated the security services with a passion for good reason in many cases, and who were very excited about the prospect after a few months of protests and the realization of like, hey, regime's not going to do anything, to go out and kill security service officers, right? Many of whom are Alawi, and most of the insurgents were Sunni Arab. So there was a dynamic that started I think it was by spring of 2011, we were starting to see like, hey, there are some low levels of violence here that could get out of control pretty quickly. And from there, it just kind of, you had the dynamic of just that sort of spiral internally, but then you started to have, external actors getting involved to sort of equip and, fund and train it, first of all, in a very haphazard way, but, they sort of fueled those dynamics internally, and it became violent.
And are you talking about like the 2011 to like 2012, 13 timeframe?
Yeah, that's right.
What was American policy like at that time? Because initially, like, we were saying that Assad was a reformer. We were all on his side, and then our policy saying he's got to go, and right, and how did that influence, if it did, you guys? And two, do you like if the U.S. says Assad has to go, do people in the country who are against his regime, do they feel like that's the wink wink, we got you, boo, type of attitude?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I mean, I would say, and there are different sort of phases to the way we engage with this, but one thing that was consistent throughout was the chasm between our rhetoric and what we actually did. There was just a tremendous gap the entire time between what we would say and what happened actually on the ground and what we did. And that made everybody confused, not in a good way. It wasn't.
When you say everybody, do you
it
mean
was
people in Syria?
Say that again.
When you say it made everybody confused, do you mean people in Syria? Do you mean people at the agency?
People in Syria, allies in the region. I think we had, Syrians who thought, okay, if you say, which I believe President Obama in like the late summer of 2011 said, Assad needs to step aside.
Yeah,
something to
I know
that
Hillary
effect.
said it. I don't know if Obama said. I know Hillary did.
And Syrians took that to mean, okay, the Americans are going to help us make him step aside, for the most part. And Arab partners, Saudis, Jords, sort of said, okay, that means you're going to help to fund and back and maybe equip and train an opposition, right? And I think that we just sort of got half pregnant on that. It was like, we're gonna do some things kind of in a very tepid way. We're not really gonna get involved. And we never provided any kind of clarity. And I think the regime pretty quickly figured this out and sort of used it to its advantage. But we just never were able to muster. And, there's a good conversation we could have about whether it would have been in the cards for us to really be involved in a much more, robust way to like effectively create, an alternative to Assad. I'm not sure if that would have ever been possible, but we didn't do ourselves any favors by, getting totally over our skis with what we said versus what was going on the ground. Right. And I think, honestly, what was going on with a lot of the stuff we were writing and with our engagement with the NSC was like, they meaning the White House, had watched, okay, Tunisia goes, Mubarak goes. Now, his regime doesn't go, but like he's gone.
Right.
Gaddafi's gone. Never mind that we acted as the Air Force for that, but let's put that aside for a second. And so there was this sort of narrative of like, this is predetermined. He's gone. It's just a matter of the circumstances. And so I think that the Obama administration thought that they could kind of step to the side, say whatever they wanted, and in like 6 to 8 months he would be gone. And that would be a win for US policy. And so it was really a policy of sort of strategic communications above all else. And then you step to the side and sort of let history do its work. And the Syrian regime is a lot more resilient and determined than any of these other sort of, political systems that had gone down. So they didn't. But that was the dynamic at the time. So anything we put out as analysts that would talk about Assad's staying power or some of these sort of violent dynamics in the conflict, like there wasn't a receptive audience, downtown for that kind of stuff, to put it mildly.
And it's weird that, after like Tito in Yugoslavia, after Saddam, after Gaddafi and the violence and, reactivation of the slave trade and all this other stuff, that like America still hasn't learned that lesson is, yes, there are some really shitty people running these countries. Mm-hmm. But then when you eliminate this shitty person who's just shitty for the fact of being shitty, that, these randomly drawn countries break down into sectarian, tribal, like warfare, and we have no solution for it.
Right.
We're like, we don't like you, so you're gone, and everybody left over. Sorry about that, but hey, you don't have a dictator anymore.
Right. Yeah, I've struggled with this too, because I think it's probably pretty challenging to like look back at the past generation of U.S. foreign policy decision making and think that we've done a good job. It's been not great, and significantly worse than the generation of foreign policy making decisions that sort of came before it. And so I don't quite know why that is. And I think, Syria is symptomatic of that, where you say, okay, well, guys, you don't have to be a genius to look at the ethnic and sectarian makeup of this country and to do a quick breeze through how the security services are organized, to kind of understand that like this thing isn't going to break well, you know. So maybe we should be more thoughtful about, you know, or at least more cognizant that it's been designed that if you break it, it's going to explode and destroy the country. You know, that was a thing that was known inside, you know, the intelligence community at the time, was like, you can't rip this thing apart without a significant amount of bloodshed. Now, we could debate whether that's worthwhile to, you know, achieve some political outcome, but like, it's not going to go well. I mean, all you had to do was look at the way that Iraq broke and say like, well, okay, this is going to be a huge mess. And there is some sort of willful blindness to that I'm still not quite sure where it comes from or why it's persisted for so long.
Right.
As you talk about this, you know, I have to wonder if there isn't an aspect, as cynical as I am about, you know, the real politic of things, but that there's maybe an ideological bent at the White House. I mean, you remember, you know, Obama would give that quote about, you know, the arc of history moves towards truth or something like this. And it sounds like that's what you're saying, that there's this idea that we could step aside and history would move in the right direction towards democracy.
Yeah, I think that was a significant part of it. I also think, you know, you look at I think, you know, that administration in particular came in and said, like, we don't want any more problems in the Middle East, please no. And I think there was this sort of this like knee-jerk, like, you know, like, let's just do nothing.
We had just pulled out of Iraq too, which...
Right. Yeah. And there was probably, you know, again, it's like, yes, we should not be spending, you know, 80% of our national security decision-making time on this region. That's a mistake. We're over-rotated.
Right.
Excuse me.
But that doesn't mean that we can just sort of, and I mean, ultimately where I fault them, because I don't envy the decisions they had to make. And I don't think that Syria, like, there was no clean answer here from the get-go, period. But, you know, it's sort of willful ignorance to just basically run the policy as a communications policy and kind of let everything else drag behind it in a really sort of, you know, incoherent and flaccid manner. Like, you just can't drag all the other elements of policy behind comms. That's, I think, what the mistake was.
So as that incoherent, flaccid policy played itself out, you have the rise of ISIS. They bust across an international border into Iraq, wage a genocide against the Yazidis and Sinjar, start moving towards Baghdad. Now we have what we would probably call in the military a clusterfuck. A full-blown
technical term.
Clusterfuck.
Sandwich. Yeah.
A shit sandwich once again in that region. And as we discuss this, I think one of the other important things to talk about is, I don't know what your view is. I'd like to ask you, but I get the sense that there were some conflicting missions, because there was on one hand the removal of the Assad regime. There's a regime change program, but there was also a counter-ISIS program. And so now we are trying to remove the government, but also the group that is also trying to remove the government. Like, whoa, what the hell are we doing here?
And I mean, I want to caveat that by even saying, you know, and to some degree, we could, because you mentioned the Salafists, right, that the regime had released, and suddenly these people who ostensibly orchestrated 9/11, right? This group of Islamic fundamentalists are now our allies in the region, and this is pre-ISIS, and we're arming them and giving them the weaponry that, you know, that to overthrow Assad or Bashir, and they're like, oh, maybe we'll go this direction instead, right? I mean, is that accurate that
think we were. I mean, look, it's a war zone. It's a civil war, so there's going to be mess around where things end up and all of that, right? That said, I think we were careful about ensuring that we were not linked up with, Salafi jihadists of the global bent, let's say, which I think in this context in Syria is an important distinction and is one that is often kind of lost in the conversation. It was like, there was a distinction between groups that were of that, a very sort of conservative Sunni Islamist bent, but were, not at all thinking about attacking Europe, our allies, us, outside of Syria. Like they were prosecuting.
Yeah, there was a hope that they would be Islamic nationalists like the Muslim Brotherhood or even the Taliban, as opposed to waging external ops.
And those groups existed in Syria, right? That was a real dynamic in the war from pretty early on. But I do think that, and this is just the reality of this conflict was like, I mean, was there ever an opportunity to really create an alternative to Assad that would have been palatable to us, that could have taken power in Damascus, controlled most of the country,
right,
and administered the place in a way that was like friendlier to our interests? I mean, man, it's hard for me to imagine. It really is. And I think, Jack, to your point, like the CT, I actually give us higher marks on the CT mission, right? Because we were much more coherent. Like the Syria policy, when ISIS started to become a much more significant issue, sort of broke into two pieces. Was like, sort of the anti-regime policy, which was an incoherent mess, and the anti-ISIS campaign, which, you talk about all kinds of problems there, but like was much more coherent in its objectives and in its resourcing. We had, a tremendous gap between rhetoric and resourcing on the regime side, the anti-regime side. I think on the counter-ISIS side, that gap was much narrower, right? We were resourcing a fight to achieve an objective of diminishing the territory and influence of the Islamic State. But the Syria policy effectively kind of became a counter-ISIS policy, and the regime stuff just kind of piddled away, in my opinion, over that period of time. Because it was also getting to the point where it's like, Assad, that sort of corresponded with the Russian intervention in the fall of 2015. Assad starts to retake ground on the backs of Russian air power, and it becomes pretty clear by 16 or 17 that he's not going anywhere, in my opinion.
And that's why the counter-regime programs you're saying they just sort of faded away naturally over time as this became sort of a unrealistic option.
I think so. And again, I don't think we ever really said that, right? I mean, it just sort of became more or less a fact of our policy that like, okay, we're just gonna, I honestly think something collectively happened inside the national security bureaucracy where everyone just kind of threw their hands up and said, you know what, like, it's too hard. We're just not going to do anything with it.
The big inflection point, I mean, didn't it come after Ghouta and some of the chemical weapons attacks, and Obama was talking, there's this talk about the red line. And are we going?
Oh God! Yeah.
And there were things that got there. There were the machinery of the U.S. government and the Department of Defense that was ready to go in and drop the hammer.
Yeah.
And I mean, Obama took that kind of like famous walk in the Rose Garden with his national security advisor and came back and said, "No, we're not going to do it." Yeah,
that's right. I do think that was an inflection point for sure. I mean, I think it was that August or September of 2013. After the attack in Duma, and that is another great example of just this sort of, hey, that is the primary example of, we said this thing, and we did we just didn't do anything. And that one is, I think, particularly egregious to me because we didn't have to remove the regime. We could have just punished it,
which is what
militarily.
President Trump ended up doing early in his presidency.
Yeah, like we could have done that, multiplied by 10 and said, this is what happens. Don't do it again. You do it again, it's going to be 5 times worse than this. And we chose not to for reasons I still struggle with.
And so let's see, pushing the conflict forward, we get to that 2016, 2017 timeframe. Now the U.S. military is in northeastern Syria, linked up with the SDF, the Kurds that we've cobbled together into this Arab alliance. How did things start to, move? How did this conflict evolve from an American foreign policy and even, defensive strategy standpoint?
Well, I mean, so at that point, things were pretty Cantonized, right? I mean, you effectively had like the idea that Syria would sort of be reconstituted in the near term as like a functioning political entity was basically gone. The regime was still very weak relative to, pre-uprising, but had kind of coalesced into, the most powerful militia in the country.
Right.
And you had 5 external powers that were, intervening in some form or fashion on the regular, us, the Israelis, the Iranians, the Turks, the Russians. So, you ended up, my frame for the conflict at some point sort of became like, this is just a bunch of warlord fiefdoms.
Yes.
And it's not useful. It's like the concept of Syria, like is ceasing to be a useful analytic construct. Like it's just a bunch of, mafioso groups that are fighting over populations and resources, with the help of different foreign backers. I think our presence there in that time period still made some sense in the counter ISIS mission. This is maybe not there's probably some problems with this analytical frame, but like I kind of look at the very small number of Americans that we had in Afghanistan that sort of supported there was this broader architecture of like elite cohesion and political will to do things that was bucked up by having us there. And I think having a small number of Americans up in the Northeast, like sort of does the same thing for many of our partners. So there, I sort of see there being continued value in that. But we effectively came to a point where the Syria policy as articulated by really both the, sort of the Trump and the Biden White Houses kind of became, at some point I saw something, it was like 5 or 6 different kind of policy objectives. And it's like there's almost so much here that there's nothing. And it's just on this kind of autopilot of,
right.
Let's make sure there isn't some kind of like catastrophic terror attack in Europe or in the United States that emanates from this place, be it ISIS or be it some of the sort of, OG Al-Qaeda guys who took up roost there, in the Northwest. And, it really just kind of sputtered out of the headlines. I'm sure it has sputtered out of like significant, the number of like deputies committee and principals committee meetings in the White House on Syria in the past, few years, I'm sure has just gone down to nothing. It's really, I don't know. It's on one sense, it's just, it's sort of like analytically very difficult to come up with anything useful to say on like what we should do. And, it's just like, everything is just kind of sputtered out in a very sort of profoundly unsatisfying way.
Into a status quo.
Yeah, exactly. Where I think at some point the regime will probably continue to claw back some parts in like the Northwest and whatnot. And maybe eventually in the Northeast, if we decide to leave and if they can reach some kind of deal with, with the Kurds up there, which both of those things would feel pretty reasonable to me. But I think, that, you know, the Syrian regime is a very patient entity, or the militia that used to be known as the Syrian regime. It's a very patient entity, and they'll just kind of wait. I mean, I think it's a generation of waiting for them.
And I mean, I think you touched upon it, but before moving on, I mean, is that how you see our presence, our continued American military presence in Northeast Syria? To your mind, it's about maintaining that status quo, about assuring some of our allies, and about ensuring that there aren't external ops directed out of Syria?
Yeah, that's how I see it at this point. Yeah. You know, I think relative to the amount of, you know, blood and treasure that's been expended, it feels to me like it's a pretty reasonable investment at this point. And it's kind of, I don't know, it's one of those things where you look at it and you say, well, it could be a lot worse, right? There could be a lot, you know, there could be external attacks planned from Syria regularly, right? You could have a situation where, you know, the Islamic State or rump elements of it begin to take more territory. So there's all kinds of sort of bad outcomes that I could imagine if we did not have a small presence there. That, to my mind, sort of, if I'm putting my, you know, my policymaker shoes on, it probably continues to justify us having that presence there. I also think that, I bet if you took a poll of most Americans and asked them, do we have troops in Syria right now? I do wonder if people, my sense is most people, I mean, A, wouldn't know where Syria was on the map, and then B, would probably say no, they're all in Ukraine now, or something crazy like that, you know? So.
And as for you personally, as your career went on in the agency, how did you feel about all these developments, one thing after the next, as we slide into this sort of, from this sort of fantastical thinking about regime change and democracy to this sort of like status quo? I don't want to use the term frozen conflict. It's not that, but it is a sort of a status quo conflict from an American point of view.
Yeah. You know, it made me really sad, actually, mostly. And it honestly was one of the reasons why I started writing the thing that became Damascus Station, the first book, was because, you know, I had lived there at that point. I'd spent most of my young adult life at that stage working on this country and thinking about it, and had a lot of friends who were Syrian, and like, it just made me really sad because the human element of it, you know, we talked about that analytic training up front in our conversation. Like, you're sort of conditioned when you're writing at the agency to like strip a lot of the humanity out of things and to just report things from a higher level, right? Like that human element, the emotions that come with it are not, you know, they're not encouraged in the writing. And when the war became when it became clear it was going to be this long, bloody kind of grind, and that, you know, we were more interested in prolonging the suffering of the Assad regime than we were in resolving the conflict. I mean, I don't think we were in a position to resolve the conflict, but I think we got to a point where effectively we said, look, there needs to be more violence so the regime comes to the table to stop. Mm-hmm. You know, just as a person, as a human, I kind of, you know, with some skin in the game in the country, and obviously a lot less skin than any Syrian had, but with more than most Americans, man, I was just like pretty frustrated and really kind of wrecked by it. And so when I left, you know, I just kind of started to write as a way to kind of deal with that, because at the kind of heart level, it just didn't really, it stopped kind of sitting well with me. And there was a point where it became a little hard to kind of just maintain that silence, you know, 30,000 foot view, like just the facts kind of perspective, because it just felt like, oh, well, you know, we're going to have just millions and millions of people who are going to get displaced, and this whole country is going to get wrecked. All the infrastructure is going to be destroyed. It's going to get taken over and pieced out by the worst warlords and psychopaths in the game here. And, you know, the people who suffer are going to be all the normal people who are like, hey, I just want to go and work at the bakery and, you know, sell cars and, like, you know, just do all the normal stuff and go to school. And like, it's just all those people who are the ones who end up being, you know, the sort of the collateral damage in these kind of conflicts, and it just kind of made me sick.
And what year was that you left?
I left in 14.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, out of curiosity, like, not defending Assad, because Assad, like Saddam, like Tito, like they're shitty human beings, right? Like they're not good people. But were those people in those, villages and those outlying areas outside of the regime terror, were they still able to like live their lives prior to the warlords?
Like before the uprising started?
Yes.
Or yeah. Yeah, I mean, it was it kind of like it wasn't, I mean, for a lot of people it was pretty desperate, right?
Right.
But it wasn't this.
Right.
Yeah. It wasn't,
and that's not
heads being sawed off in the town square.
Right. And yeah, you didn't have half the population displaced, and you didn't have a 90% poverty rate, and you didn't have $250 billion of infrastructure damage, or any of these kind of things. But the thing that I think one of the most sad things about this is that you look at the way the society was sort of divided, and you look at the way the regime was constructed. And there is a certain inevitability to the violence and chaos and the destruction of, like, you can't, Hafez al-Assad designed his government so that you couldn't just like excise him and the family.
Right.
And the country continues to function, and you put better people in, and then you're rolling. Like,
right.
He designed it so that you couldn't do that without an extreme level of violence, and that most people understood that, so that they didn't do it. Right. So, I struggle with this idea of like, there was a certain inevitability to the way this went down, or at least you would have said it's probably the most likely outcome. Right. And on the one hand, and on the other hand, you look at the people who came out to protest early on, who were essentially asking for dignity in a system that deprived them of that.
Right.
And that kind of contrast is just, I think, really a devastating one, because you look at the reasonableness and the humanity of a lot of those of those people, right, who are like, hey, I just don't want to have to get approval to get married from the local head of the political security directorate, or I don't want to pay bribes to add a second floor to my home that will impoverish my family, and I need that space in order to sort of house my kids. Like,
they're like,
what do you think this is, New York?
You could not legally work. You could not get a passport.
Yeah.
I mean,
so, and we see this. And again, I mean, I think Iraq is a great example in the sense of Saddam was horrible. His sons were horrible. Like the things that they've done to the Kurds, to their own citizens, it's well documented. Yeah. We know about it. And then, when we look at a regime like Assad, when we look at these regimes, particularly in the Arab world, I think, because we do have the Salafi kind of hanging out in the wings, right? Like ready, the Salafists. For you, with your experience and your knowledge, if we were to rewind time and you were the king of America and could make the decisions, do you think there were right or wrong decisions to make in that area?
Yeah, I think that it's the absolute hardest question to answer. I think there was probably a period of time that was like the first 6 months where, and again, I think I struggle with answering the question, because on a geostrategic level, when you look at Syria, like, not from a human level, but from the strategic, like, is it worth it? Right. Like, is it worth the amount of attention that we pay on a country that at the time, is 22 million people. They don't have nuclear weapons. They don't have oil. They have geography that matters. Right. But that's kind of it. So I struggle with whether we would ever be able to really effectively resource something that's like, hey, let's help create a political alternative to the regime that exists. But I think there was a period in those first 6 months where we may have had an opportunity to, more effectively support the protest movement and to try to create, some kind of coalition inside the region and in Europe that could have done more to support peaceful protest in the country and to try to create, some kind of, concession, some kind of structure where there might have been concessions from the regime or, at least cultivating that protest movement. I think we could have done more, but as soon as it went violent and started to get really violent kind of that fall into the, early 2012, so like 8 to 12 months down the road from when the protests first started, there weren't institutions in the country, groups in the country that we could have really probably supported to affect change that would have been amenable with our interests. That would have been really hard, and it's hard for me to imagine what that could have looked like, for sure. But I think more could have been done early on. But would it have led to a different outcome? I don't know. I just think that we could have done more.
Well, sometimes when I look at these situations, I wonder, well, why Assad and not Mugabe? Like, why aren't we going? Like, why do we pick one dictator?
But if they had a substantial protest movement against Mugabe, maybe we would have.
Maybe. But the thing is it's just a question of why do we pick?
Yeah, right.
One
why
dictator.
Why not Myanmar?
One dictator over another. Say, oh, this person's a shitty person. I mean, look at Gaddafi, right? Gaddafi was playing ball with us, essentially. Yeah.
I think that if the dominoes had gone down in a different order, I think we might have done to Assad what we did to Gaddafi, or something closer.
Well, that was Assad's fear, wasn't it?
It was, and the fact that Libya wasn't going so well. Yeah. That, pretty early that spring was kind of like, hey, we're already over rotated here, guys. We can't go and do something in Syria. If Syria had gone, if the order had been Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, and not Libya in there, we might be looking at a very different region right now. But yeah, I mean, your point's a good one of like, why Assad and, why not others? And, I do think there was an element here of,
he was vulnerable.
He's vulnerable. And, there are always these kind of, fever dreams of, we're going to roll back Iranian influence. Right. And, with Assad being such a critical Iranian ally, I think there was a sense of like, well, we can deal the Iranians a blow here. Yes. Which that mattered to, I think, a lot of the people making policy. Yeah. In that season, for sure.
But we can go back to the Bush administration and say sort of the same thing. Is that like Iran has never been a friend of ours, and Saddam, for all of his evils and faults, was always an opponent of Iran, and yet we're like, oh, screw you, and somehow our policymakers, because I don't want to say the analysts, because analysts, I think, are brilliant. Like, analysts, I think, see this stuff, and whether people pay attention to them or not is another issue. But the whole idea, you talk about our recent history, right? Our recent administrations, you know, in World War II, it's like if you break it, you buy it. Like we're not leaving
Yeah.
Germany until Germany's self-sufficient. We don't just hand it over. Like in Iraq, you go in, you break it, and you go, here, you guys, we're not occupiers. We don't want to be occupiers.
This gift of democracy.
It's the gift of democracy. We're just going to hang out and help you, but we're not going to rebuild all the infrastructure.
That's right. Well, and I think, I think if you dug like Metternich out of his grave, or you took some of the guys who helped build the system after World War II, and you sat them down and you're like, hey, I'm going to give you like a 2-hour briefing on U.S. policy in the Middle East over the past 25 years. I mean, they would probably leave that and be like, you guys are morons.
Yeah.
Like what I don't understand
Right.
fundamentally what you've done.
Right.
And it's hard. I'm drastically oversimplifying, but as you kind of look back at the arc of all this and think about the way that Syria fits into it, you're just like, I don't understand. Like, I don't get it. It has to be the case that there is some combination here of like, this region doesn't matter all that much to us.
Right.
Really. We can't be, I would say low marks for the sort of humans who have been making most of the policy over the past 2 generations on this, so like, or the past generation on this, like they haven't done a good job.
Mm-hmm.
And, we're also sort of profoundly enamored with this region. Mm-hmm. So there's sort of these fantasies about it that make us behave in very
irrational ways,
stop and go irrational ways of like, we're disengaged, or we're fighting, 2 land wars at the same time.
Yeah. We can't make up our mind.
Right. Yeah.
So David, you left in 2014, and did you have this idea that you wanted to go and be a spy novelist right off the bat, or was there another job? I mean, presumably you didn't go back to being a cashier at Wendy's. I mean, what was the next step off for you?
Dust off the old red apron and go back into the business. I left and took a consulting job, and the thing that became Damascus Station, I started writing, like, I basically had 3 months after I left the agency, 4 months after I left the agency to when I started that job. And that's when I was just kind of processing stuff and writing, and it was all very unstructured. It was very poorly written. I wasn't writing it to be a book. I was just kind of writing for me. And, I took the consulting job started, I kind of just put that away. But in that time period, I had found like, I really love this. Like, I actually love writing, and I found it, and, again, we talked about that kind of anodyne analytical writing that you do at the agency. I felt really like freed from that, for the first time in a long time, of like, I can actually write with emotion and color, and like, I can play around with language, and I can I can find my voice and figure out what works. And that to me was this wonderfully freeing, fun process where I felt like I was really kind of, in tune with the universe. And I loved it. And so I ended up having an opportunity after about 5 years of consulting to take some time off. And I was just burned out. And I went back to the manuscript and I reread it, and I'm like, okay, this sucks. But, I want to rediscover that magic. And I think I would like to write a spy novel. Like, I'd like to actually try. Like, I'll just see if I can do it, right? Like, write something that I want to write, and write something that somebody else might want to read. And so I kind of came back to it, I think, with space, with maybe more maturity on the writing side, to think about, how do I actually craft a story that someone wants to consume? And then, frankly, some distance from Syria, where I wasn't just like dealing with it. I could kind of harness that emotion that was still there, but I could use it in service of the characters in the story. And so in those 6 months, I just started to go back to the writing, and Damascus Station, kind of by hook and by crook came out of it.
So I mean, the book really is beautifully written and has this sort of like authenticity that really I think could only come from somebody who, you know, lived in Syria and also has an intimate familiarity with the Central Intelligence Agency, that really comes through in this book. Do you want to tell the folks out there, you know, what your book, what Damascus Station is about?
Yeah, sure. So it's a story about a CIA case officer named Sam and his Syrian recruit Mariam, who they break a kind of fundamental rule of espionage and fall into this forbidden relationship. They go into Damascus to hunt down the killer of another CIA case officer, and in so doing, really kind of come face to face with the tension and the conflict and the passion in their own relationship, but also into conflict with a really pretty brutal pair of Syrian brothers, one of whom is also much more than meets the eye. And these guys are kind of guarding this very dark secret at the heart of the Syrian regime. So, you know, it became, I think, as I wrote, obviously it's a spy novel, so it's about espionage, and I'm trying to deal pretty realistically and authentically where possible with, you know, the kind of, not just the tradecraft of the agency, but its ethos, its culture, what it's actually like to be a CIA, you know, officer. But I hope it's also about kind of love and loyalty and also like what it means to be a human in the middle of a really awful conflict. You know, I told the story through the lens of I took multiple Syrian perspectives on this because I really wanted to try to get down to the humanity of like, what are actual people doing and experiencing in the war, and kind of get away from, you know, for me, one of the cleansing things was kind of getting away from like, I don't have to come up with the answer on Syria policy or say what we should have done. I can just tell a story from the standpoint of different Syrians in the conflict. So, you know, I hope in some sense it's that too.
And yeah, no, I mean, now that you say that, it does jump out there. You know, the sort of Syrian protagonist of the book is a member of the elite class. Maybe doesn't even understand how much privilege she has. There's that interesting scene where her and her friend break down on the side of the road and are helped out by people who are literally dirt poor. And you kind of played that culture clash out very well.
Yeah, no, it's funny. That is one of my favorite scenes in the novel, because I think that there's this kind of class, you know, in central Damascus who they're in a bubble. They're all connected to the regime in some way, shape, or form. And, you know, you're sort of, some of them are, you know, presumably coming face to face with this reality that like, there are elements of this being sort of a slave society that they're running here, you know, and how do you, in the character in the book, you know, like, how do you deal with that as this very privileged daughter of the elite who's like not necessarily doing anything wrong bad, you know, but who is elevated above these people and in control of them in some way. What do you do when you're just sort of dumped into direct face-to-face kind of confrontation with them, where you're forced to see them as people, you know, and not just as the other, or these, you know, we can sort of put them out of these shanty towns and not think about them. So, you know, a lot of the book, I mean, there's, you know, another Syrian protagonist who's a security officer who kind of is always having to wrestle with some of the same questions, but who I think comes to a very different set of answers, you know.
And something that I think our listeners will be interested in, and what caught my interest in your book, is that part of the plot, without giving too much away, part of the plot is that the president gives a lethal finding on somebody in Syria. Word that David's not allowed to use, assassination.
It's not an assassination. It's just a lethal finding.
And I thought it was fascinating reading the novel about that. Like, you kind of like detail that entire process, and it's a work of fiction, folks, but it was very fascinating, I thought, to read as you kind of like walk through step by step how that takes place from the legal side, from the policy side and how a finding like that gets pushed through to how out in the premier intelligence services secret facility that we're not allowed to name, where the rehearsals for that plot are acted out and how this conspiracy takes shape and ultimately is enacted in Syria. I thought that whole sequence of events was a very interesting part of this novel.
I had a lot of fun doing that. And I think, one of the things I wanted the book to be, again, without it becoming boring or pedantic, was a bit of an intelligence procedural. I think there isn't, and this isn't a knock on the genre in the least, but just there's just not a lot of spy fiction that does that.
Yes.
And I, when I come across it, I enjoy that a lot. So I was kind of writing this for my own, nightstand in a lot of ways of like, I like books that get under the hood a little bit and give us the inside baseball and kind of make us wait for the payoff and the action, because they kind of build to it. And so I wanted to go through those steps because I think it's really interesting how
it was
this thing of like, okay, we're going to kill somebody. There's a whole system and there's a whole system of legality and bureaucracy, and then just sort of like machining and production that goes into this kind of stuff.
Like technicians that have this hyper specific job that were focused on this one thing.
That's right. And I just think it's fascinating. So I kind of wanted to do that end to end, and I was glad they didn't edit too much out.
Yeah, I mean, you did, people like you that served in the agency, and even, some people might not realize we read a novel that has to go through the PRB, the Public Review Board.
That's right.
What was that process like for you? Was it difficult?
It was actually pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
I've heard from colleagues who have to go through the DoD process that it's much harder and much more disorganized and chaotic and slow. The agency is actually pretty streamlined at this. Like, I think, I like to think it's because the person reading the books maybe just really loves them, but they read them pretty quickly and get them back to me, in, I don't know, under 2 weeks with pretty reasonable edits both times. And I source them because I'm a little bit OCD. So Damascus Station went to them with 300 footnotes or something like that of hey, here's, because I worked on Syria. And so with that one in particular, I wanted to be buttoned up. So I just said, okay, here's, in this book, this page, here's where I got this. So you don't have to, this is a specific thing.
You mean
you don't have to think it came out of my, the classified regions of my brain.
Right. And so, and I'm sorry I interrupted you, but when you say source, you mean you show them open source, the open source references, so that it's look, this is already out there in the public, in the public knowledge. So I'm not saying something that hasn't been reported on or.
That's right. And one fun example that I think I actually have the book back here. There's a thing in the here it is. So there's a book by Sam Dagger called Assad or We Burn the Country, which is a good history of the war, and he's got some great sources inside the Syrian regime. And there's a thing in there about how because Assad's a philanderer, and he sleeps with the wives of other members of the Syrian elite to kind of demonstrate his control over the system. And that's sort of been a pattern. And that's a specific fact. It's referenced in the book. And I wanted to make sure that the PRB isn't oh my gosh, where did this come from? And so it's just okay, well, it's on, page 145 of Sam Dagger's book.
Right.
Footnote, you can find the book. Here's the page number, here's the title, all that. And that tends to, that's an effective way to kind of make sure that I'm separating the classified regions of my brain from what's available in the open source.
That was actually a major plot point in one of Mark Graney's books. about Syria.
Was it really?
Yeah.
As Mel Brooks,
well, it's true.
As Mel Brooks says, it's good to be the king.
And the other thing, so I read your forthcoming novel as well. We'll talk about in a moment, but I wanted to talk for a moment about the commonalities between these two books, because when I think of your work, at least that I'm familiar with so far, the one thing that really jumped out at me, that where you're really strong, is in describing the life of a person, like an actual human being living and existing in a authoritarian regime. Mm-hmm. And it's a view that I think is so alien to Americans. The views are going to be very black and white, not a lot of nuance in there. You really describe these people who are part of the regime. They're part of the predominant system. They're not necessarily bad human beings, but they are part of the system for all the good or all the bad, whatever you think about that. They're a part of it, and they're trying to find a way to exist in it and just live without having their heads chopped off, right?
Yeah. No, it's I think that is true thematically across both books, and I'll say that neither of them started with any intent around doing that. It was just sort of discovered, the process of discovering these characters and writing them, like that reality started to become very clear to me. So like in the Syrian example, there's two primary characters, Miriam and Ali, who are having to deal with this idea of like, hey, I might actually be very privileged. There might be a lot of things that I have in the system, but my level of sort of agency is pretty limited. Mm-hmm. And my ability to sort of exist as a human, like morally, is compromised before I've done anything. Mm-hmm. Before I've actually made a choice.
There's that line in the book that like, we're chained to Assad's throne or something like that you write. Yeah. No. And I think that is true in the Syrian system. And, it was when I came to Russia for Moscow X, like, again, I didn't start with this idea of like, I'm going to tell a story about living in an authoritarian system, but my major Russian character named Anna is a Russian intelligence officer. She works for the SVR, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, and she works effectively as a knock for the SVR, what they would call their I'll butcher the Russian if I say it, but they call it the apparatus of attached employees. So it's basically she's an SVR officer who's a banker. And I was really struck as I just started to kind of do research on, not on like high level questions of Russian policy and history and whatnot, but like, what's it like to be a Russian, And I was really struck by this concept of like the wily man. I don't know if you've heard about this way of characterizing kind of Russian interactions with the state. It's just so the parallels to Syria were very profound because, again, it's an authoritarian system, same as Syria. It's obviously a different cultural context and a different system in a lot of ways, but you have this feeling of like how the state sort of just is. Mm-hmm. It's both extremely predatory, but also worthy and eternal. And, I sort of, especially in Russia, you have this idea of like, okay, well, I'm not really going to protest. I'm going to be very patient. I'm not going to resist. I'm just going to kind of adapt to the system. And I have kind of a passive displeasure or even like a mockery of the system, but I'm not going to demand kind of like full rights and freedom in the way that we would define it. And I think there's just this idea of I'm trying to eke out for myself inside this very messed up kind of double speak, double think world. I'm going to try to get what I can.
Right.
And that's kind of it. So you have these little moments where people are asserting their own dignity and their own humanity, but it's far short of how we, as Americans would define kind of a full measure of freedom and agency. And so the character, especially this Anna character in Moscow X, is like, she's coming at the world with that as her starting point. Like she's not trying to be free in the way that we are. She's actually, there's a line in the novel about how when she finally sort of, well, I don't want to spoil anything, but she basically says like, I've stolen from a thief and I'm going to get away with it.
Right.
And that's the win. Like like you're a thief. I'm taking from you.
Right.
That's my victory.
Right. Everybody's getting their own, so I'm going to get mine too.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And fundamentally, in a system that's unjust and amoral, is there any such thing as
breaking the law?
Like breaking the law? Like, does that, like, is it immoral to break the law in an amoral system?
Right.
Tough questions. I mean, one day in the life of Ivan Denisovich, they're asking those questions, in the gulag.
But I feel like that's an ethical question for every citizen of every country. Like right? Wouldn't you believe that certain laws are immoral or whatever else?
The other commonality between the two books is the character Artemis.
Yes.
Who is in, so these books exist in the same world very much. So Artemis in Damascus Station is like, in my opinion, a batshit COS you would not want to work for.
Which is a real thing.
Yes. Fair. That's fair. And then in Moscow X, she's leading this, this special access program called Moscow X that you guys will read about when the book comes out. Who is Artemis based on? I mean, I'm not looking for a name, but
sure you are. Spill the tea. We got it. We can handle it.
She, so initially, like all my characters have started, like when I start to write them, I write scenes and I write backstory and dialogue and stuff that I know is probably not going to be in the finished product to like just kind of get to know the character. And most of them start as composites of actual people. And I will not give the names because if I gave the names for Artemis Proctor, I would be hunted down and murdered, and I want to stay alive. But there are a couple case officers that informed her character, and kind of started like as I was initially crafting her, and initially writing her. Like I was thinking about them, and so I just kind of started riffing with that, a composite of a couple female case officers that I knew. And like any good character that's going to work in fiction, pretty quickly, that composite got left behind. She became her own entity with her own voice, and we were just kind of off to the races.
But she was a character you couldn't deny.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, and most of the good ones are because they just start to like, okay, I can kind of hear.
Yeah,
I know what she sounds like. I know what she says. Like I'm in communion with wherever she exists in the universe. So like I'm moving her onto the page. But she is a good vessel for a lot of great stories that I have gotten from DO colleagues over the years. like the most unchained, crazy stuff that you get, from listening to stories from these guys. Like, and there's a lot of crazy stuff. She's some combination of like competent and also deranged. She's a great sort of, mouthpiece for a lot of that stuff.
So talk to us about Damascus X. The book is coming out next month. What is this novel about? Because it's a totally different subject than Damascus Station.
Moscow X.
Did I say Damascus?
Yeah.
So yeah, that Freudian slip. Damascus X was a real thing in real life when you guys got booted out of Syria and you were living in another place for a little while. Moscow X, the book that's coming out in October. What's this novel about?
Yeah. So I started with a concept, and we can talk about how real events have sort of, made writing this thing very hard, because I started and I said, okay, what would it look like if from a covert action standpoint, the CIA really took off the gloves against Putin. That's kind of where it started. It's like, what's from a CIA standpoint, what could we do? So the book, Moscow X, is a fictional component inside the real Russia house that's kind of charged with this outside the box, pretty aggressive approach to dealing with the Russians. And the idea that comes out from some measure of sort of, geopolitics, but also Artemis Proctor's personal grievance, is to convince Vladimir Putin that a coup is afoot when one is not, and to destabilize or sort of weaken, his regime accordingly. So the agency taps two officers under non-official cover, commercial cover. One is a lawyer in Europe. The other one runs a family thoroughbred horse sort of breeding and dealing operation in Mexico, to go and actually target and recruit one of Putin's money men to get access to some of his personal funds. The money man is married to a woman named Anna, who we talked about her earlier, who is an intelligence officer. The CIA doesn't know that. And she's also just sort of playing her own game entirely. And the book is really the cat and mouse between the agency and between Anna and Vadim, her husband. And, as I wrote it, it kind of became this story of like, vengeance, and what does it mean to tell the truth? What does identity look like in a world where most of the intelligence officers in the book are under pretty exotic forms of cover that are very demanding on humans. And so, like, what does identity look like in that world? And then, what does all of that look like in kind of the real context of the sort of covert war between Washington and Moscow? So that's what the book's about.
And again, our listeners out there will be very interested in this book. That it's about Knox, people who are working under non-official cover. And again, it's fictionalized, but the procedural aspects of that, and like maybe how something like that kind of sort of works, including like the national resources side of it, how you bring American citizens into maybe a covert action program. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in this book that I think people will be interested to read.
Yeah, I agree, or I hope so. And it was fun to deal with the commercial side of the house, the commercial cover side of the house here, for a couple of reasons. One was just the reality of trying to write, the demands of a story in fiction are such that, like, if a big point of the novel is the relationship between the case officers and assets, like, they need to spend time with each other.
Right.
And if you're writing a story about agency operations in Russia, and you're using officers who are under like embassy cover, you're not spending a lot of face time with Russian assets inside Russia in that context, right? When you strip away the sort of, diplomatic cover side of it and talk about Knox, like, from the standpoint of fiction, you're in a much more flexible world where things that wouldn't be possible in kind of the world of Damascus Station, fast forwarded to Russia, are all of a sudden possible. And then, kind of more, I guess, technically, as you kind of look at the way that human intelligence is being collected and will be collected in the future, because of, ubiquitous technical surveillance, all that kind of stuff, like, it's increasingly challenging for people who are under sort of official forms of cover to even do this stuff anywhere. So you're starting to, see this kind of flexibility, or a need for this kind of flexibility in the way the CIA runs human intelligence gathering operations. And I think playing around with that in this book was a lot of fun.
So the book comes out next month. I assume it's got to be up for pre-orders now if people want to go and grab it. I think it's going to be a big hit. I enjoyed Moscow X more than I enjoyed Damascus Station. So
that's good. I think I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
I am. It was harder to write. It nearly killed me, but I'm really happy with how it turned out. And I think, I don't know if we talked about it, Jack. I think there was some like gunplay, I think, in Damascus Station that sort of broke you toward the end. Cause
there were some
veer off.
Hollywood moments.
I was wondering, because this has come up on our show before, and I was wondering if Jack sent you any hate mail about weapons handling.
He didn't send me any hate mail. No, he gave an honest review of Damascus Station, if I recall.
Yeah. I mean, I thought it was a really good book. There's a couple scenes of the female protagonist going Rambo that were a little bit. I was like, oh my gosh,
those are fun to write, though. Yeah, no, that's fair, and I think there's probably marginally less of that in this novel. I think my sort of sensibility when it comes to these stories is I like to push that a bit. Like I'm not trying to do the full shoot 'em up thing, which is wonderfully entertaining but totally divorced from reality.
Right.
And I'm also not trying to do the full kind of, rainy procedural. It's a balance.
I will also say, David, because I mean, you are a really talented author, and if you were to do a book that was more looking at either the agency paramilitary arm and that side of things, I would be very, very interested to read that as well. Like if you were to write a book more in that direction, or the JSOC agency collaboration, like I would be all in for that if you wrote that
just
book.
make sure Jack gets a chance to look at it, because you will get the hate mail about the wrong caliber of weapon.
Like I hit up Mark Rainey.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
But again, that was an advanced copy. I was like hoping he could fix it before it was published.
Yeah.
But, oh well.
Do you have a writing process? Did you develop one? Do you know the end of your book when you start?
So it's been, I feel like my process is a total mess, and I don't think there's a better way for me to do it, because I've experimented with like outlining, and I found that doesn't work for me at all. So what I've done, or where I've sort of landed, is I usually start with an image in my head of the climactic scene in the novel, like where all of the tension is going to build to and sort of where it's going to explode. With Damascus Station, it started with an image of people. It literally started with an image of a couple sort of face to face in a Syrian interrogation center, which is what happens in the book. And then in Moscow X, it started with an image of a woman riding away from a burning house on horseback. And that was it. And so I was like, how do I get there? And the whole process of writing the book was like trying to get to that scene. And I didn't know, like, the woman on horseback, I didn't know what her name was. I didn't know she was Russian. I didn't know whose house it was. But I was like, I felt that was where the book should get to. And I started to write with that in mind. The story actually started, this is why it's such a mess. The story started in Texas, and the whole novel was going to take place in Texas. And I wrote about 7,500 pages of that, and it didn't work, and I just threw it away and then started over because it wasn't right. So I usually start with that image. I start to play around with the characters, and try to understand voice and kind of who they are and all of that. But then I'll just kind of, usually what I do is I try to get about 2,000 to 3,000 words in a day. And I'll show up at the coffee shop. I always write from a coffee shop. Same coffee shop, usually the same table, same cup of coffee. And I'll sit down after I drop the kids off at school. I'll write until lunch. I'll eat lunch. I'll get another cup of coffee. I'll write in the afternoon. Get those 3,000 words in. It's a good day. And, you just knock it out that way. I usually end up writing, I would say, if the novels are somewhere around 125,000 words, I'd probably write about 500,000 words to get the novel.
Holy shit.
And, I don't know how to do it another way. The comparison I like, or the sort of analogy I like to use is like, if you're going to put together a 13 or 14 track album, you didn't write 13 songs. Probably you wrote 30. Right. And those were the tracks that made it,
Right.
And so it's hard to know what the final thing is going to be unless you write a lot more. And like, I sort of play around with it that way and figure out where I'm going to get the most punch. And it's, I've finished the third one now and I'm kind of putting the final touches on that. And, like I've started each of them thinking it will be easier this time because I've already written books. And it hasn't gotten easier yet. Let's just put it that way.
What's can you tease book 3 at all?
Yeah, it's a sort of modern homage to Tinker Tailor. So it's a legit mole hunt in the CIA. It's Proctor in the sort of George Smiley role. It was very fun to write because it's really more her, like it's kind of her story. The working title right now is The Seventh Floor. So the, CIA executive floor. But that one is pretty much done. And I'm hopeful we'll have some news on when that'll come out, hopefully pretty soon.
That's awesome, man. We'll have you on when that book is out or coming out.
Great.
Anything else that you want to tell people about? Anything that we failed to cover here tonight?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we hit a lot. This was fun, guys. Yeah, this was really fun. Thanks for having me on. It's fun to go back and relive Syria and talk about the books. This is great.
Where can people find you? Where should they go and look for your books?
Yeah, so you can find me at davidmccloskeybooks.com. That's my site. You can find the books pretty much anywhere. I mean, you can pre-order them on Amazon. You can get them on Target, Walmart. If you want to support your local indie bookstore, which is always something I recommend, you can go to IndieBound and find a local indie near you, and they'll hook you up with the book. You can get it on, Apple Books, and you can get it anywhere. The audio book is not up for pre-order yet, which is kind of frustrating, but it'll be up very soon. And it'll be out, shortly after the release. So for those of those listeners who just do audiobooks, that's coming, and you'll be able to pre-order that really soon.
And for our viewers and listeners, there'll be a link down in the description for people who want to go and check out his books. I also want to give a quick shout out to our friends at Casa Carabeo, who gave us some really awesome cigars. The Don Nello torpedoes are really good. If you go to casacarabeo.com, you'll be able to check them out. Really enjoying their stuff.
We have a few questions.
Okay.
Actually, first off, Dee sent me an email that he picked up in chat. Someone in chat asked if the book you were referring to is called Psychology of Intelligence Analysis by Richard J. Hauer.
There you go. That's it. Yes.
Somebody nailed it.
Somebody nailed it. There's got to be another analyst out there watching or something like that. That's exactly right.
Paul, thank you very much for the donation. I don't see a question. If there was a question attached to that, please just type in the chat right now and we'll pick it up. Ohms, thank you very much. Cheers. And a couple from our Patreon subscribers. How would you explain TikTok to the everyday person and why they should be worried?
Oh man. I don't know if I feel qualified to answer that question.
Do you have TikTok?
I don't. I guess everyone should probably be worried in large part because it's highly addictive and is like wrecking people's brains and capacity to focus on information. So that's one element of it. I mean, on the other side of it, and again, I don't, there are far more authoritative sources than I on this, but, I don't have a great sense of like how much of this information, I mean, maybe you guys know the answer better than I do, is like actually harvestable by the Chinese. And, got to think about who you're giving that information to, but I don't have a highly educated answer on this other than my reasons for not using it are purely because I already find my attention fragmented and I feel like I would prefer to not give it to cat videos and other such nonsense.
I mean, friends don't let friends do communism, folks.
Animal videos are great. But yeah, I think that like one of the discoveries about TikTok, obviously Facebook and Google, they're all horrible in terms of what they collect personally. But I think TikTok was actually, you were getting it wide permissions to access a lot of shit on your phone that it wasn't even connected to.
Yeah.
And look, I mean, it's like 23. Well, I won't say any genetic information, but it's like a lot of these my heritage tests, where you can get your genetics. It's like the Chinese own most of those, and you can say I'm a nobody. It doesn't matter, but at the end of the day, maybe it matters to your grandkids. That
right.
That.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, yeah. Oh, I'm glad I don't have. I have not. I know a number of authors who use them for like book promo and stuff like that, and I've so far. I mean, maybe it's more out of sheer laziness, but I have so far stayed off the talk.
Yeah,
don't do it.
Call me Ishmael. Do you think that the intelligence community correctly managed the start of the Russo-Ukrainian war, or do you think there was a credibility problem that led to missed opportunities?
I mean, with the caveat that I, haven't been reading any of the actual intel on that, right? I'm just sort of reading what gets leaked out and what's available publicly. I don't know. I mean, it felt to me like I would give the administration and the IC pretty high marks from the standpoint of we knew it was coming and we effectively, I think largely effectively sort of leaked information or provided information into the public sphere and to allies to like demonstrate that was going to occur. So relatively high marks there from sort of a plans and intentions standpoint. Like it seems like the assessments were pretty good. Again, I'm not reading them. What I have seen again from leaks about like our assessment of the Russian military's capabilities and the Ukrainian, military's capabilities doesn't seem like the analysis there has held up so well. That's an inherently harder question to answer, right? Because you're talking about the dynamics of a war, but that feels like it was sort of missed. But again, I'm looking at this from way on the outside, and I'm coming at a lot of this from the standpoint of,
right.
Researching a novel, right? Not writing policy papers for a think tank. But so I don't know. I think I'd say relatively high marks on kind of what's Putin up to, and then not as great on what will the dynamics of the conflict actually end up being. I mean, it seems like we dramatically underestimated the Ukrainians' capacity to resist and organize and fight, and we overestimated the Russians. I think there's sort of this kind of tendency to either view the Russians as like completely incompetent or all-knowing and all-capable, and the answer is somewhere in between, and it seems like we didn't get that right.
Out of curiosity, as an analyst, did you ever feel as though you were ever under political pressure, whether it was from an administration or from internally in the agency, to provide answers that somebody else wanted?
The first thing I'd say on this one is like the agency, at least on the analytics side, I think more generally, really does take politicization seriously, or at least it did. I don't know now, but like they beat that into you right off the bat of like, you're speaking truth to power. You're going to speak up if, someone, says something that's wrong. Like, and I was in meetings with, Director Petraeus where like very junior people would like contradict him, and say things that he didn't agree with. And you're like, that's positive, right? There's something in the sort of bloodstream of the organization that's pushing people to do that. So, that was always very serious. And like, if someone raised issues around politicization, like that got noticed, like that, you didn't want to be involved as a manager in like a complaint about that.
Right.
I do think that there were sort of subtle forms of it. Like, it was because of that overarching structure, the way that policy, the way that the White House would sort of influence things was a little bit more of like, okay, let's take Assad staying power as an example. Like, it wasn't that a piece would be rewritten to say that he will fall. It was that things would get watered down through the writing of the PDB, and oftentimes when things got to like the DNI kind of level, they would be mushified to either say nothing or to sort of soften the analysis so that you could kind of ignore it or interpret it in different ways, or things would just be kind of maybe more omitted, like pieces that were very clear and hard hitting. And I think substantiated would sort of be like, oh, well, maybe that's just not going to go into the PDB.
Yeah.
Because there's only like 10 articles that'll get in anyway. And there's always something else that could rise to the top. So maybe that's just not going to be there. Maybe that's going to go to, the senior director for the Middle East and North Africa, but it's not going to go to the president, that kind of thing. So and trying to understand why that was being done was impossible. Like, is it really because we got bumped because there was a more important China piece that needed to get into the book?
Right.
Or are you looking at this and saying, oh, this is a stinker. Like, I don't want to go into the Oval with this thing because then someone's going to yell at me, or we're going to have an argument, and I don't want to do that because I want to continue to get invited into the Oval. It was always hard to tell, as an analyst. So you had to tread very carefully before you started to say, okay, that's politicization. But I think in total, you saw that on the Syria side of things. We knew that there were analytic lines that the administration just didn't want to hear.
Well, and maybe not just the administration, not pointing at, any president or their administration, but even inside the agency, because the agency isn't this monolithic thing. It's made up of people who want to get promoted. Right.
Yeah.
And have different motivations for why they're doing what they're doing. So
totally.
Like, I'm not necessarily like calling out the administration for anything, just that I was just curious as to, was there ever, like you said, there things might get watered down. Somebody didn't want to be the bearer of bad news. I mean, even with China now, we hear that A, they're on the brink of bankruptcy, and B, they are ready to take over Taiwan and create
it's
this,
sort of schizophrenic.
But it's also two things can be true.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. That's absolutely right. Two things can be true. And, like you can have people who just for very like, it's not like a nefarious,
right.
I'm trying to silence the analysts. Like, that wasn't going on.
Right.
It was more like, hey, if I'm the, DDNI and I'm the one who's kind of in charge of the PDB and I'm the one going in and I'm the one giving the briefing, man, and there's some real human tension there between bringing bad news and having access,
Right.
Like you sort of have to be really thoughtful about how you kind of meter that out, because you can't be bringing pieces every day that are like slapping the administration's Syria policy in the face. Like, there's just going to be a limited tolerance for that. And eventually they're going to be like, we don't want this guy to come here anymore.
Right.
Like, send us somebody else,
Right.
So I think you get down to that human level, it starts to become less nefarious and much more just like someone's trying to do their job and kind of get by,
Right. What is your perspective on sport washing by Saudi Arabia? Should U.S. sports fans attempt to push back against Saudi influence or control over domestic leagues teams, or just accept that it's inevitable?
Well, I mean, I don't know what we do about it. I can tell you that I find it sort of kind of gut wrenching and sickening in general, just to have them buy all this stuff off. I don't really have like much of an analytic basis behind any of that other than just, I'd prefer to not have all these like wonderful athletes purchased by Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, what do you do about it? I don't know.
Right.
I haven't thought about it much. It just kind of gives me a knee-jerk, sick reaction to see it happening.
Yeah. Like I
don't fault any of the athletes for doing it.
No.
It's like this crazy amounts of money and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, it's frustrating. It kind of actually gives me the same sickening feeling like, and this is a minor analogy, but it sort of it speaks to the same thing of like, when I look at, I'm a big baseball fan, right? And when you look at what's happened to the game with just things like the name, the way that stadiums and ballparks are named now and all have corporate names attached, or the way that sort of gambling has now totally infused the life of the sport. Like you're watching MLB TV and they've got all these like parlays up on the screen and stuff like that. It's like, I don't like this stuff intruding into the game, and I understand why it's doing this, and I understand that it's important to the economics of the game, but you kind of wish at some point that like some corporation would be like, it's our civic duty to help sponsor this stadium, but it doesn't mean that we have to call it like, progressive field. Like it can continue to be called Jacobs Field, but we're going to support it because like we're a citizen of this city.
Right.
And I think I feel a similar sort of like knee jerk, like, when I see the Saudi stuff of like, I understand why this is the case. And I really wish that these like beautiful games weren't just bastardized by, corrupt corporate and political entities.
Yeah. And then why do you think Arab Spring fell short? And judging by events in the U.S., could the same spring happen here, but for the wrong reasons?
I don't know if I want to touch the latter part of that one. I think, I mean, the Arab Spring I think failure is probably right. Although I would say that it was very, like, the way it came out was very uneven, and it depended a lot on the sort of political context and the system and the structure of the society in which those sort of mass kind of uprisings occurred, right? Things shook out very differently in sort of, one man or one family sort of presidential republics, quote unquote, than they did in like constitutional monarchies, right? So things came out very differently in like Jordan, and in Bahrain even than they did in like Syria, right? And in Libya. But what I would say is like, in terms of just not getting to really any kind of solid kind of democratic outcomes in any major Arab state. I mean, I would say, look, you're talking about a couple generations now of a region that is extremely uninstitutionalized, dealing with massive socioeconomic issues, youth bulge, issues with educating and just kind of getting people into jobs, like all these kind of major systemic problems. You have a tremendous amount of sort of, geopolitical rivalry inside this region between different, between largely like a sort of Saudi-led camp and an Iranian camp. So you have all these like structural problems. It's like those things, like trying to get to some kind of stable democratic order in a system like that is like almost impossible. So, that'd be what I'd say. Like, it's just the deck was completely stacked against any country getting to a much better outcome. Mm-hmm. And not by like millennia of history, but just by like the last couple generations of the way this region has developed.
Yeah, I mean, basically, since Westerners drew up the country lines a lot of times.
I mean, drew up the country lines. Like, I mean, the way that it's an extremely militarized region that also lacks a lot of like institutional structures and processes that kind of limit conflict and things like that. So it's like, you're not in and it's a region that has dealt with a huge amount of external intervention by great powers too. So you're not dealing with like a great petri dish here for a democratic experiment,
Right. A couple more questions came in. Jackson, thank you very much. Ever interact with Ground Branch guys? Any plans for Ground Branch specific novel?
Do it.
I mean, look, I'd be interested in doing it. I didn't have much interaction with them when I was on the inside, to be honest. So it would be, I'd have to lay some real groundwork in source networks and things like that to actually understand how it all functions. But I would be very open to doing a book that focused there. I imagine there'd be a tremendous amount of material and it'd be a lot of fun to do. So very open to it, but no plans as of now.
And M. Corbin, thank you very much. Thoughts on CCP's means of waging war by ever means up to actual confrontation with U.S. military apparatus? Oh, the idea that the way the CCP is waging war on the U.S., do you think it'll ever mean or lead up to an actual confrontation with the U.S. military?
What?
And just whatever your answer is, if we ever do or don't go to war with the CCP, people will quote this saying you.
People will go back. Yeah, this is going to be a very important piece of the historical record.
Yeah. No pressure.
I agree.
Yeah. No pressure.
I need to think long hard. I was like,
your
I shouldn't have had all this whiskey beforehand.
Will live in shame or honor based on your answer right now.
Man, I feel like this has been a very casual and fun interview up to this point, and now it's not anymore.
It always gets here, though. Like
gets here.
We are gotcha journalists at the best.
Three drinks later, here we are.
Yeah.
Oh man, I mean, I guess the answer is I don't know. But then beyond that, very useful answer, I would say, it would seem to me like there will be some, like if I had to put money on it, right? It seemed like we're headed that direction.
Right.
Like,
and you're not talking about
when,
the next 5 years or 20 years or 100 years, but it seems inevitable.
It's going there. Point. It's going there. Yeah. Like I just think structurally you have a country that's like, hey, we would prefer to write more of the rules in East Asia. You're doing that right now. And how is that conflict going to be resolved?
Right.
So it seems like it's probably coming. And I don't know. I don't have no concept of what form it will take or anything like that. But, if I had to wager, I would think that would happen in the next, generation or so, for sure.
And that is the end of the questions. Somebody asked about a chicken. No, I'm just kidding. No, that's it.
All right. So, yeah, thank you, David, for coming on the show, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. This was fun. I really appreciate you having me on.
And next Friday, we're going to have Brent Tucker on the show, former Delta operator. So we hope to see you guys then.
Monday, don't we have something Monday, D?
We have a Patreon bonus episode sometime next week. We're gonna figure out a day.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to come in Monday.
Okay. And Moscow Station and Damascus X.
Damascus Station.
Or Damascus Station and Moscow X. Sorry about
Damascus Station and Moscow X. Yeah.
But read them. You'll get the nitty gritty.
Yes.
Like real stuff from real people. I mean, what more can you ask for?
All right, guys.
Amen.
So we will see all of you next Friday. Take care, everyone.